The international community publicly outs Bahrain as a human rights offender. But will it make any difference to the country's political activists? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is free speech in Bahrain. Diplomats from Bahrain got a rare public scolding on Monday as the UN Human Rights Council put the Gulf nation's record under the microscope. It's called a Universal Periodic Review. Diplomats from around the world met and criticized Bahrain's delegation for not implementing real democratic reforms over the last 5 years. At issue was the resumption of executions, putting civilians on trial in military courts and oppressing free speech. That last point was apparent at a UN event because some of the kingdom's toughest critics, although invited, weren't there. Bahrain blocked dozens of activists from attending the meeting in Geneva, rounding them up and charging them with unlawful assembly, and then barring them from travel. Human Rights Watch had called on the country's Western allies, namely the United States and Britain, to put aside their military alliances with the tiny island state and take a stand on human rights. And it seems they did, but is being reprimanded in public enough to promote free speech in Bahrain. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Geneva by human rights activist Mariam Al-Khawaja. She's the special advisor of the Gulf Center for Human Rights. And from Kuwait City, Ayad Al-Mana. He's an academic and political analyst. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Ayad Al-Mana, let me begin with you, sir. Let me say from the outset that we tried very hard to get the Bahraini government on. A few years ago, it was easier to get them on. This time, they flatly refused our invitation multiple times from multiple avenues. You have all this criticism at the UN, and then they barred these activists from going to an event. What does the Bahraini government have to hide, sir?
Thank you very much. I think the best way is to start with Mrs. Khawaja, because she is an activist in the human rights and one of the person who usually blame the government of Bahrain at its record in the human rights. Anyhow,
I'm not sure what you mean by that. If you could answer the question, that would be good, sir. What does the Bahraini government have to hide?
Well, I don't think the Bahraini government anything to hide. The Bahraini government applied its laws and regulations, and it is citizen. It is an independent and sovereign state and can do what she likes to do within the laws and regulations has been approved by the National Assembly. Some of these people definitely accused of resorting to violence or agitating violence, and that they will not be allowed to go till they had been taken to the court, and whether they are innocent or no, this will be decided by the judiciary, not by the political system.
And do you believe that they will receive a fair trial and a fair hearing?
Well, I think that they will receive a reasonable treatment. You know that our culture is different from the Western culture. Sometimes, unfortunately, there is an excessive use of power or violence against those who've been investigated. But I doubt it very much in Bahrain that there is an excessive power against these opposition. Unfortunately, these people are mostly from one sect, and they always agitating the public to revolt against their government. They always listening to the Iranian authorities and media. Those people don't wait at least a little bit till the democratic experience arrive, and that might give them the way what happened in Kuwait. During the early 60s, there were something of conflict between the government and the opposition, but now all respect the constitutional court and the constitutional constitutional articles.
I want to bring Mariam Al-Khawaja in. Mariam, when Iyad Al-Mana said they only listen to what comes from Iran, you had a wry smile on your face. Tell me why.
Because that's generally an accusation that's used by pro-government groups, that anyone who criticizes the government of Bahrain on human rights issues must be listening to Iran, which in and of itself is quite interesting, given Iran's own human rights record, that Iran would actually be creating an entire civil society of human rights defenders to go out and criticize the Bahraini government. It's not very logical to begin with. But if I may, on the different issues that were raised right now, first of all, on the issue that Bahrain has nothing to hide, why is it then that Bahrain is refusing to accept the entrance of these special rapporteurs from the United Nations into the country? For example, the special rapporteur on torture, who was supposed to visit Bahrain, and his visit was effectively cancelled only days before he was supposed to arrive in the country. It shows that they do have something to hide. If they had nothing to hide, it would actually be really good for them to allow these international bodies into the country to look at the situation, to actually verify that what the Bahraini government is saying is true. On the issue of the judiciary, I think Human Rights Watch said it best when they said in Bahrain you do not have a dysfunctional justice system, but rather a highly functional injustice system. The judiciary today is being used as a tool to silence dissent, as a tool to go after activists and human rights defenders. And if we're going to talk about the use of the law in Bahrain, the terrorism law in Bahrain actually can even regard the work of a human rights defender as being terrorist activity. As a human rights defender, as a Bahraini human rights defender myself, I have one case in Bahrain currently pending under the terrorism law. And this is the case with many different activists. And then, of course, there was the issue of, the respecting of the law and how in Kuwait they made so much progress. I think, ask the people who just came out of prison in Kuwait for having challenged the emir on the constitutional issues where the emir was trying to create some changes. There is still opposition in Kuwait. There are still human rights issues. Not comparable to Bahrain and what's happening right now, obviously. But I think that, even looking at Kuwait, there are human rights issues that need to be addressed. When it comes to Bahrain, he said that we don't give them the time to actually implement human rights changes or reform. The Bahraini people have been waiting for 230 years.
Okay, let's
230 years that this monarchy has been ruling in Bahrain, where we have not seen this.
Okay, so, Mariam says 230 years they've been waiting for human rights. Let me ask you, let me pick up on one of the points there, Iyad Al-Mana. Why doesn't the Bahraini government let in the special rapporteur and say, we have nothing to hide, come and have a look, we're not torturing anybody, you investigate, take a look for yourself? Why not?
Well, I just told you that we have also something of this complexity that a sovereign independent state act as it like. Sometime the governments suspicious of those who came to look to their records. We know that most of these activists, especially in the European side, they always want the ideal type of democracy.
I don't understand this, sir, because you said, hold on, so you said excessive use of power, but you were sure that this was not happening in Bahrain. And now you're saying, don't expect Bahrain to be an ideal type of democracy, and maybe it is happening. Which one is it? Is it happening or is it not happening?
It is not happening in the torture you are thinking about. But there is no ideal type democracy over the third world, and especially in the Arab world. The Iranian, which is beside us, they have a revolution in 1979. They have always elections for the parliament and for the presidency. But believe me, they don't have democracy. They don't have human rights. They are hanging people on the electricity outside their houses. And these Iranian, they are not defending, as Maryam saying, they are not defending the human rights. They are trying to infiltrate inside Bahrain to overthrow the government and extend its influence to other Arab countries, as it had happened in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, which is under control nearly, and they try to do the same in Yemen.
Let me give you something, sir.
Bahrain.
Let me give you something. Let's take the Iranian point and build on it and pose something interesting to Maryam. Maryam, it would be remiss of me not to mention what Murtada Sanadi said very recently in Qom. And again, this is not sort of jumping into conspiracy theories. Here you have a prominent Bahraini cleric in Qom, the holiest city in Iran, saying in January, quote, "From today and hereafter, the period has changed. We in the Islamic Wafa movement announced that we have begun a new phase as a tribute to the martyrs. One grip on the squares and one grip on the trigger." So when he says something like that, Miriam, it can't help your cause, can it? Because the government says, you see, we told you so. Tell me how much that harms your cause, Miriam.
Well, I mean, you know, the thing is, you have to look at the situation in Bahrain. First of all, I was misquoted by Mr. Ayad. I did not say that about Iran, the way that he said I did. But I think, you know, in general, about this issue of violence versus non-violence. The civil society in Bahrain has been, the political movement in Bahrain has been, for the past 6 years, non-violent. And for 6 years, we've been talking to the international community, we've been talking to human rights institutions, and we've been saying over and over again, if there is no accountability, if Bahrain continues to enjoy international impunity for the crimes, the massive crimes that they have been committing over the past 6 years, there will be groups that will resort to violence. This is something that is common throughout history, anywhere you look. When you take away people's access to peaceful tools and to peaceful solutions, people do tend to turn to violence. This is something that happens in every single country. In Bahrain, for 6 years, people have been non-violent. There have been some splinter groups that have used things like Molotov cocktails, but generally it's been a non-violent struggle. So it's, you know, if you look at history, there is a reason why people are starting to talk about the use of violence. They have seen how, you know, generally with the use of non-violence, the international community has continued to do business with Bahrain as per usual. There has been no real accountability for the human rights crimes. As a human rights activist and as a non-violent activist, do I support this? Of course not. Okay, but we have to look at the situation within context if we want to resolve the issue.
Let me then ask you about the international community. So you have the US and their Fifth Fleet has just, you know, moored off Bahrain. The UK is an ally. They all sell weapons to the Bahrainis. The Europeans are allies. I mean, your father's in jail as a Danish citizen. The Danes can't really do much about it. The odds are stacked against you, right? Because Bahrain is on side when it comes to the international community. So is it a hopeless cause that you're fighting, Maryam?
Definitely not. You know, when we took to the streets in 2011, all of us, whether we were, you know, of all different sects of the country, it wasn't just a one sect specific, which was the sectarian comment made by Mr. Ayad. We were actually people from all sects, from all drives of life, from all classes in Bahrain that took to the streets in 2011. I was there personally myself, and I saw my friends from all walks of life taking part in those protests. And those protests were about a better Bahrain. It was about introducing a constitution that was agreed upon between the people and the monarchy, because the monarchy, the king of Bahrain, had unilaterally changed the constitution in 2002, announcing himself king and making Bahrain a kingdom and placing himself above the constitution. And so this was about human rights, it was about democracy. And so what we're looking at when we took to the streets, we knew we weren't just fighting the Bahraini monarchy. We knew that this was going to be a fight, a struggle against 6 monarchies of the GCC and also against all of the allies of the Bahraini regime. And so we know that this is, you know, an uphill struggle. We know that this is a struggle that is going to take a very long time, but we're willing to do that. If it means that the next generation is not going to have to go to prison, to be tortured, to be subjected to extrajudicial killings, then it's worth the fight.
Yeah, Ayad Al-Mana, she's saying, there's splinter groups, sure. There are those who throw Molotov cocktails, sure. There are those who go to Iran and give inflammatory speeches, sure. But the more you squeeze the Bahraini population, the more you're likely to see this. But this doesn't mean that all those people who are protesting for basic rights are terrorists or Iranian agents. Doesn't that sound reasonable to you, sir?
Yeah, and just let me remind Mrs. Khawaja that during the peaceful protesting in Lulwa Square, the protesters themselves, they were managing themselves and doing everything they like. Their speeches over the whole area. But when they actually decided to attack the government institutions and go through shouting against the regime from the east part to the west part and the opposite, unfortunately the government has no alternative but to intervene.
It was bulldozed and they brought Saudi troops in. But again, let me ask you, what do you expect with the protests? What do you expect them to say? Nice things? They're protesting. Of course they're going to be saying things against the regime.
I expect the protester to understand the situation of their own country and to use only the peaceful means, not to attack the royal palace, not to attack the parliament, not to attack the Salmaniya hospital and occupy it and other places, and not to attack the policemen and kill some of them and burn cars and so. That's what happened. I am one of those who been solidarating with the opposition in the democratic side and the demands. But when it comes to respond to the Iranian calling, no, we will not allow Bahrain to be part of Iran or to be influenced by Iran.
Okay.
I just want to remind Mariam, excuse me, just 1 minute.
Very briefly,
just
please.
to remind Mariam, why the wifaq withdrawal from the parliament, and who are the leaders of this opposition? Do you think that clergymen want a democracy on the style of Europe or India or something?
Okay, so let's give Mariam 20 seconds to answer that.
An Islamic Republic, as Hassan Mshayma said it publicly.
Okay, Mariam, 20 seconds to respond to that, and then we wrap. Okay, Mariam.
All right, so I mean, thank you for the reminder. First of all, I'm not a member of Al-Wafaq, and so that's not really a question to be still to me. Second of all, Mr. Ayad obviously did not read the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, which is a report that was paid for and accepted by the king himself, which actually refutes a lot of the claims that he's made, like the takeover of the Salmaniya hospital, like the attacks. The royal court was not attacked. It was a peaceful protest. Actually, the protesters were attacked. And so a lot of the information that he's giving is actually not true, based on the government's own report. In regards to whether there can be a democracy or not, I believe, yes, that's what we're aspiring for. Obviously, you know, whether we're looking at a Western-style democracy is not the issue. We're looking at a situation where we want, the people of Bahrain want a representative government, whether that's in the form of a republic, not necessarily a theology, but a republic or a democracy. That remains to be the will of the people of Bahrain. It has nothing to do with Iran. If you have a problem with Iran, go talk to the Iranians. Okay. Why are you punishing people in Bahrain fighting for human rights and democracy and saying that it's Iran's fault?
Because it doesn't make sense. You're a position loyal to Iran.
Okay, I've got to wrap.
And that's it. Do you know Hassan Mshayma or not?
I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, sir. I've got to wrap. I've got to move on with other segments. But it's been a pleasure talking to both of you, Ayad Al-Mana and Mariam Al-Khawaja. Thank you very much for joining us. Coming up next, we throw back to the day when Osama bin Laden was killed. How has Al-Qaeda been transformed in the 6 years since his death? And murder as online entertainment? We ask a sociologist why hundreds of thousands of people watched someone get killed on Facebook. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Osama bin Laden was killed on May the 2nd, 6 years ago. Some described his death as the nail in the coffin for Al-Qaeda. Others dismissed the group's leader as a mere figurehead. So what does Al-Qaeda look like today? With groups like Daesh and Boko Haram in the news almost every day, has Al-Qaeda taken a back seat? Or has it been rebuilding while out of the spotlight? Shoaib Hassan reports.
He was the target of the largest manhunt in modern history until US Special Forces killed him in a raid in northwestern Pakistan. May 2nd, 2011 was the end of Osama bin Laden's reign as America's enemy number one. US leaders hailed it as a turning point in the battle against Al-Qaeda.
For over 2 decades, bin Laden has been Al-Qaeda's leader and symbol, and has continued to plot attacks against our country and our friends and allies. The death of bin Laden marks the most significant achievement to date in our nation's effort to defeat Al-Qaeda.
The response was euphoric. Americans came out on the streets to celebrate.
This all started when I was in 9th grade, you know, and everyone remembers where they were when 9/11 happened, and it's the end of a certain era for sure.
It was that day in September 2001 that followers of the Saudi-born militant carried out coordinated attacks on major US installations. But the irony was not lost on the select few who knew the origins of bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. It grew out of Arab fighters who flocked to join Afghanistan's resistance to the Soviet invasion. They were financed by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, trained by Pakistan, and armed and facilitated by the US. But bin Laden would later become anti-American following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. He felt that the arrival of US troops in Saudi Arabia tarnished Islam's holy land. The Saudi government expelled him from the country, leading the embittered militant leader to launch his own private crusade against America. It culminated in the 9/11 attacks and started a 10-year chase that ended with the killing of bin Laden in Abbottabad. Many thought it was also the beginning of the end for his militant group. But Al-Qaeda's footprint has grown since bin Laden's death. Al-Shabaab, based across the Horn of Africa, pledged allegiance to the group in 2012 and increased attacks in Somalia and Kenya. In the same year in Syria, Al-Qaeda's new leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, called for the group to take advantage of the deteriorating situation, leading Al-Qaeda in Iraq to form Daesh. Daesh broke away from Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq in 2013 after Abu Bakr Baghdadi refused to obey Zawahiri's orders, and the faction within Daesh loyal to Al-Qaeda became Jabhat al-Nusra. In the same year, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb was forged in an alliance with the Algerian Group for Preaching and Combat. In 2014, Zawahiri formed Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent to carry out attacks in that region. In 2015, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula made major gains in Yemen as a Saudi-led coalition launched an offensive against Shia Houthi rebels. Daesh lost many of its gains in 2016 to Turkish forces in Syria and to coalition forces in Iraq. Al-Qaeda-linked Jabhat al-Nusra responded by rebranding itself Jabhat al-Fateh al-Sham. This year, Jabhat al-Fateh al-Sham has recaptured territory from Daesh. Al-Qaeda now controls more territory than at any time in its history and continues to grow. And the US is no longer the only target in its crosshairs, as this attack in Moscow shows. At least a dozen people died after a suicide bomber blew himself up at a crowded metro station. Al-Qaeda later said it carried out the attack in reprisal for Russia's military support of Syria's Assad regime. That's happening 6 years after the ultimate blow to Al-Qaeda, the killing of its leader. But many are asking, has it really made any difference? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is journalist Loretta Napoleoni. She specializes in reporting on the financing of terrorist organizations. And from Kampala, Uganda, counterterrorism expert David Otto. Thanks so much, both of you, for joining us. Loretta, let me begin with you. Al-Qaeda 6 years on after bin Laden, is it stronger or weaker?
I would say that it's weaker, but it was already weak 6 years ago. I think the advent of the Islamic State, the birth of the Caliphate, and the jihadist movement in general has been a terrible blow to Al-Qaeda.
David Otto, do you agree with that? Al-Qaeda's weaker 6 years on?
I think, it depends on what you're looking at, because, what bin Laden did when he was the leader of Al-Qaeda, even before he was killed, was that he had rebranded, Al-Qaeda in such a way that, Al-Qaeda would not just have a centralized system, but it would have a very decentralized system with cells all over the world. So I believe that, the death of bin Laden, which is a strategy of leadership decapitation, which, essentially takes away the leader, did not affect Al-Qaeda. As a matter of contrary effect, is that Al-Qaeda has become more powerful because, you have extension of Al-Qaeda, not just in Afghanistan. You still have the powerful ideology which is being bred in Pakistan. You've got Al-Qaeda in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in Libya, Syria, Nigeria, Somalia with Al-Shabaab. So I would be very, very careful in saying that Al-Qaeda has been weakened. In my experience, with how these groups operate, I think Al-Qaeda has become more powerful, more disorganized, which is a very, very big problem for counterterrorism countries.
That's really interesting. So Loretta, you followed the money, right? So you'd be able to verify that bin Laden himself created the kind of franchise system just before he died. And as a result of that franchise system, now you have Daesh and you have Boko Haram and you have all these other groups. So isn't this just sort of Al-Qaeda in myriad forms rather than the centralized command and control structure that we saw 15 years ago?
No, actually, I disagree with this analysis. The Islamic State has nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. It was founded by al-Zarqawi, and which was Tawhid al-Jihad, and no relationship whatsoever with Al-Qaeda. It was in 2005, the year before al-Zarqawi died, that Osama bin Laden welcomed al-Zarqawi into Al-Qaeda, and he nominated him the emir of Iraq. But the organization was completely different. Al-Qaeda was fighting against a faraway enemy, the United States. Al-Zarqawi, Tawhid al-Jihad, all the radical Salafist movement is concentrating on the near enemy. This is a dispute, this is a quarrel that goes on since the mid-1990s. So no, I disagree actually. I think there are two completely different brands here. One is Al-Qaeda and the other one is the Islamic State and jihadist movement. Boko Haram, to answer the previous question, Boko Haram pledged alliance to the Islamic State. It did not pledge alliance to Al-Qaeda or al-Zawahiri, who we think is still
But Loretta, aren't they just pledging allegiance to the strongest game in town at any given time? They're just looking for whoever's the biggest fish, and they want to pay homage to the biggest sort of mafia boss when it comes to jihadism, isn't it?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, but that shows that Al-Qaeda is not the biggest fish. He hasn't been the biggest fish since after 9/11. And I think the key issue here is the ideology. Are we fighting against a faraway enemy? Are we actually producing a nationalist kind of version of what was, the jihadism? And this is what the Islamic State has done. And this is what people are doing, are pledging alliance to that model, not to the model established, not the transnational terrorism established by bin Laden.
Okay, I want to bring in a third guest now, Rahimullah Yousafzai from Peshawar. And he's actually a journalist who has interviewed Osama bin Laden, has interviewed many of these senior figures. It's a pleasure talking to you, sir. What do you think? You heard a little bit of what preceded you here. Is Al-Qaeda fundamentally weakened now that Osama bin Laden's not around and hasn't been around for 6 years?
I think Al-Qaeda has been weakened in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. This was the headquarters. This is where Osama bin Laden was based, and also his two very important, lieutenants, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Sheikh Taseer Abdullah. So in a way, Al-Qaeda is no longer the way it was able to dictate terms here, and it actually has tried to affiliate itself with other local militant groups to stay relevant and to be able to operate here. But I think in many other countries, Al-Qaeda has become a bit stronger. So Al-Qaeda was not present in its present shape in countries like Syria, Yemen, or in the African countries. So I think it has become weak here in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, but its affiliates, and those who are aligned with it, they have become stronger in their own areas.
David, while there's a lot of focus on the likes of Syria and Iraq, do you believe that governments have taken their eye off the ball maybe and allowed Al-Qaeda to flourish in areas that are not as popular, if you like, or don't have as much attention as theaters of war like in the Sahel?
I think one thing I have to mention clearly to my two other colleagues is the fact that when we want to describe the strength or the weakness of a terrorist organization, there are three areas that you look at. One of them is the motivation, what kind of, the Salafist, Wahhabist ideology that Al-Qaeda has, which is the push and pull factors, which is what actually allows terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda to be able to recruit. The other part of it is the capacity of the organization. What is the capacity of Al-Qaeda now and the capacity of Al-Qaeda when bin Laden was there? That's the second factor. The third factor, in order for you to judge whether a terrorist organization is weak or powerful, is to understand, the level at which these organizations can attack. The level at which it can target, its enemies, or near or far. So when you look at these three factors, the motivational factors, when you look at the capacity and you look at the attack strategy of Al-Qaeda, I don't think, it would be proper for you to say that Al-Qaeda has actually been weakened. Because as my colleagues said, you've got Al-Qaeda not just in Afghanistan, not just in Iraq, not just in Pakistan, but you've got Al-Qaeda everywhere. You've got Al-Qaeda factions in Boko Haram, which is Jamaatul al-Sunnah leader Watid, run by Mohammed Yusuf. You've got Al-Qaeda, breeding within Al-Shabaab. You've got Al-Qaeda in Libya. So I think it is very much, something which we have to look into very carefully. You have to understand that, ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, came out of, Jabhat al-Nusra, which was an Al-Qaeda in Iraq before they moved to Syria. So you cannot actually say you want to tear away Al-Qaeda from ISIL, because these organizations, they have the same ideology, albeit, there are different strategies and tactical methodologies of actually attacking. So for me, when you look at what is happening today with Syria, when you look at what is happening in the rest of the world, and you look at the activities of ISIL, you can see the activities of Al-Qaeda, because this is what Al-Qaeda wanted. This is what bin Laden wanted. Bin Laden wanted, the ideology to spread all over the world. They didn't care about the leadership.
But David, he also wanted America to collapse,
What they cared about was the ideology.
Sure, but he attacked on 9/11. He wanted America to collapse,
yes,
financially and so on. It didn't. It's pretty strong. It's still quite strong. So in that sense, he failed, didn't he, David? That is why many people find, I guess, Daesh a lot more appealing, because they're not just an America-only organization, are they?
Yes, but you cannot also distinguish between Daesh and Al-Qaeda, because Daesh, is an offshoot of al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda. So what you have to understand is, the war is still being fought. There are no winners, there are no losers. What we have
it's not necessarily an offshoot of al-Nusra itself, David. It was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then split, right? So you had Zarqawi and Baghdadi who split, but Nusra came afterwards. So it's not necessarily an offshoot of Nusra as it is today. It was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then became ISIS or Daesh, and then of course you had Al-Qaeda and
of course
Nusra
today you have
but not Nusra as it is
Jabhat al-Islam.
Sure, Fatah Sham,
today you have
not as it is right now.
Well.
Okay, I don't want to get into those technicalities. So, okay, Rahimullah Yusufzai, let's talk about leadership for a second. You have Zawahiri. Clearly, he doesn't have the gravitas of someone like Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden, a big guy, a massive symbol for so many people, right? He had that kind of almost demonic charisma. Zawahiri doesn't have that, but do people underestimate him as a leader, Rahimullah?
I think that Osama bin Laden, being the founder, the financier, the man who also fought against the Soviet forces, he was much larger, much bigger than anybody else. And when he was killed, I think Al-Qaeda was on the decline. And Zawahiri inherited a very weak Al-Qaeda. I think that Al-Qaeda, the real Al-Qaeda was born here in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. The affiliates, the offshoots, the other groups, they are very loosely aligned with Al-Qaeda. I don't even think that they take orders from Zawahiri. Zawahiri is on the run, he has to survive. He tries to stay relevant by issuing statements from somewhere. He may be in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, but I think for him, for Saif al-Adil, for others in Al-Qaeda here, it is a matter of survival. And they have aligned themselves with the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban to survive. And that's why, I think it's very difficult for Zawahiri, to even run the organization,
right.
to control the organization.
Sorry to interrupt you, because we are running out of time. There are unconfirmed reports that he's in Karachi, possibly. Is that possibly true?
Oh, I think nobody knows, Actually, nobody knew where was Osama bin Laden. And of all the places, he was found in Abbottabad, not very far from Islamabad. So Zawahiri could be in Pakistan, he could be in some big city or in some remote area in the mountainous north, we don't know. He could be just across the border in Afghanistan in areas controlled by the Afghan Taliban. So I think one of these days, maybe he'll be found out. But right now, nobody knows where he's living.
Loretta, talking about unconfirmed reports, rumors of a merger, possibly, between Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think there are discussion. They have been discussing since the fall of east of Aleppo. I mean, what we must understand is this is a very fluid kind of situation. I mean, fighters move from one group to another group, according to who is winning in that particular moment. The Islamic State is still as a presence in Syria, so it is likely the people that have been evacuated, that had to run from East Aleppo, decided maybe, to merge and join. But I think the real issue here is not the name. The real issue is actually the motivation, the ideology. All of these are trademarks. I mean, look at, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. It was founded in 2003 with, it was self-funded, 100%, no money came from Al-Qaeda, and they picked that name because, of course, that was the name, the most important name at that very moment. Today, we have new groups who actually want to be affiliated with the Islamic State because that is the new trademark of jihadist terrorism. But what is important is what is the objective. And here we have a difference because the Islamic State created the caliphate, and the caliphate is an instrument of the jihad, is an instrument of the fight. Osama bin Laden saw the caliphate is the end of the jihad. That was the end of the battle. I mean, that is a fundamental difference.
Yeah, David, that sounds reasonable to you, doesn't it? That for bin Laden, that was an end after defeating America. And for Baghdadi, you have to create the Khilafah, the caliphate first, and then you attack whoever you want to attack. You'd agree with Loretta, right?
Well, of course, I do agree with that. That was bin Laden's plan of action, which, of course, did not, see well with what ISIL is doing. What ISIL is doing is actually creating, a caliphate, so that, it can stake, a much more a practical way of actually achieving, their objective. And one thing which we do have to agree is that, everywhere that you find Al-Qaeda factions, you would also find Daesh factions, which means, these terrorist organizations, besides having one ideology, besides having a little bit of difference in terms of their operational and tactical strategies, they do work, they do coordinate, they do collaborate. So it is very important for the world and counterterrorism countries to understand that these two organizations, are joined to the ribs. They are almost acting as one. So if there is any talk of Al-Qaeda merging with ISIL, I think, I will not be very, very surprised to see that. But, we have to understand that Al-Qaeda, for me, is the same as ISIL. They're not different.
Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wish we had more time. It's the worst part of my job, calling it quits here. But it's been fascinating. Loretta Napoleoni, David Otto, and Rahimullah Yousafzai.
Oh.
Thank you all for joining us. All this week, we're taking an in-depth look at Hungary. And what a time to do that. Thousands of people have once again hit the streets of Budapest in a show of support for the European Union. They're angry over what they say is Russia's creeping influence over their prime minister and his policies. And out of their movement has risen a new political party. It's called Momentum, run by a group of young activists. They say if government power is to be put in check, it's young people who must be responsible. Natalie Perhonen went to Budapest and has this report.
To find Hungary's youngest political movement, you need to head to the pest side of Budapest and then go underground. This is no typical campaign office, but Momentum is not trying to be an ordinary political party. It wants to shake up the status quo, and its biggest asset is youth.
If we look at it from a biological perspective, so for the next 30, 40 years, the members of Momentum and this young generation going to determine which direction Hungary will go.
The party does not see itself as leaning to the left or the right. Instead, its president describes members as patriotic, progressives and reformists. And some of the key issues are improving healthcare, education, good governance, and criticism of the current government's Russian orientation.
This political party consists of a lot of different people with different political opinions, but we came together because we have got common values. Like we would like to establish a strong European country, for example.
Social media is an integral part of Momentum's strategy. It's also what is setting them apart from traditional parties which are less likely to engage with voters through blogs or Twitter. Many of the group's members, including Fekete Győr, were born in 1989. The year when communism collapsed in former Soviet bloc countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And around the same time when a young Viktor Orban was entering the realm of politics as a founding member of a party called Fidesz. Prime Minister Orban's populist policies have come under fire from large sections of young people. They've been taking to the streets to protest against a higher education law, which could force out the Central European University founded by George Soros from Hungary, creating an opportunity for Momentum to get a stronger political foothold. Momentum gained attention with their year-long No Olympia campaign to stop Budapest's bid for the 2024 Olympic Games. They gathered more than 266,000 signatures to call for a referendum on hosting the event, and that led to the city withdrawing as a contender, generating goodwill and awareness beyond its target group of the country's youth.
I don't really know them except they were vetoing the Olympics. I found it very smart.
Among its target in the electorate, there appears to be a vote of confidence.
I really like what their thoughts on this country and what they want to do. And I just really like, they're really young and they just have new and fresh ideas, which is really cool.
But it will need more political success to make a difference at the ballot box. And now they're using guerrilla tactics like changing the government's Let's Stop Brussels campaign to Let's Stop Orban.
There are almost now 10 opposition parties, so it's hard to be that one when the voters would think that it is not a waste of their ballot if they would pick that party.
In 2018, Hungary is heading to the polls. Both politicians and the public are expecting it to be a long and tough campaign. It's also going to be the biggest test for Momentum and whether it can actually convert support into seats in the parliament. Marian Ori works at the conservative newspaper Magyar Hírlap.
So it's hard to say whether Momentum can do it on their own, and they're not really want to join, I think, one bloc because that would be not to not too authentic for them, as they are positioning themselves as a new force which is outside the older parties who are, in their views, are already discredited.
Hungary has form when it comes to young popular movements turning the course of history. Whether Momentum can propel itself into parliament will depend on the appetite of voters for an outside perspective to politics as usual. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers, Budapest.
In the next installment of our series, we'll take you inside a university protest in Budapest where students are demanding a controversial law around foreign-based universities be overturned in the name of academic freedom. More on that tomorrow.
We have a full roadmap of products to help build groups and community, help build a more informed society, help keep our communities safe. And we have a lot more to do here. And we're reminded of this this week by the tragedy in Cleveland. And our hearts go out to the family and friends of Robert Godwin Sr. And we have a lot of work, and we will keep doing all we can to prevent tragedies like this from happening.
Is live streaming crossing the line? As you just heard, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is working to prevent murders from being shared in real time. He made those comments after a U.S. resident in Cleveland, Ohio, filmed himself killing an elderly man. But a little over a week later, a father in Thailand live streamed himself killing his young daughter. So, can Facebook really make good on its promise to safeguard its site? And what obligation do social media companies have in preventing gruesome incidents from being broadcast to the world? Yvette McCullough reports.
Social media has given us an entire broadcast station that fits in our pockets. The ability to share videos with the world whenever we like, or in real time. Live streaming and video sharing on platforms like Facebook, Periscope and YouTube is breaking down the barriers of traditional media. But what happens when that power to transmit instantly and unfiltered is used to share sinister or criminal content? Last week, 21-year-old Thai man Wutasan Wongtalai filmed himself killing his baby daughter on Facebook Live before taking his own life. In a statement, a Facebook spokesperson said this is an appalling incident and our hearts go out to the family of the victim. There is absolutely no place for content of this kind on Facebook, and it has now been removed. This murder is the latest gruesome act to be published on Facebook. Earlier this month, Steve Stevens filmed himself shooting dead a stranger, 74-year-old retiree Robert Goodwin Sr. in Cleveland, Ohio. The video was online for several hours before Facebook took it down. Stevens also posted other videos bragging about the killing and claiming responsibility for other murders.
That's what I did. I killed 13 people.
After a 2-day manhunt, Stevens killed himself during a police chase. And in January, 4 people in Chicago were accused of attacking an 18-year-old disabled man and broadcasting it on Facebook Live. There have also been reports of sexual assaults, animal abuse and teenage suicides being broadcast live. Social media has given editorial power to the people, but is it too much power? And as the line between being just a platform and an actual broadcaster is increasingly blurred, do these companies need to take more responsibility for the content being shared and do more to protect against it? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining us now from Sydney is Zuleika Zevallos. She's a sociologist and social media consultant. Thanks so much for joining us, Zuleika. There's been torture, there's been rape, there's been all sorts of horrible stuff happening on Facebook Live, and now murder. And now what's more interesting is that, not that it's actually happening, which is egregious in itself, but that people are watching, hundreds of thousands of people are watching. Why are we watching this stuff on Facebook Live?
The precedent for this is historical. people have always had some sort of fascination with crimes, in particular with very violent crimes, including murder. So if you look back over different societies, and in Western societies certainly, across history, whether it's books, true crime books, or art, or the fact that only a couple of 100 years ago, people would buy death masks of people who had been convicted and executed. People have always had a fascination with murder. And there's been some interesting cases as well. In California, for example, in 1991, there was a case that went through the courts where a TV station wanted the rights to broadcast public execution to the public. So there's always been a fascination with the public about death. And what's happening now is just that technology has facilitated that process by bringing the tools to people to be able to broadcast it themselves.
Yeah, there was this sense of contrition from Mark Zuckerberg earlier on as he's trying to say, we're going to fix this, we're going to make sure this doesn't happen. My thoughts and prayers, my heart goes out to the family of the old man who was killed. But I guess, is it Facebook's responsibility to try to put a lid on this stuff? Is it their job to do that?
Yes, I think that Facebook and other media platforms do have a role to play in this. Currently in the United States, Facebook is protected by law. They can't, they're not liable for the content that their users upload. Nevertheless, they are a very profitable company that needs to really step up the way in which it regulates the content that users put up. And there's been many cases where the algorithm has failed, such as some of these latest cases with the crimes that are being broadcast. But also, if you look at some of the other posts that people put up, whether it's you know, women breastfeeding their babies or Indigenous women at ceremonies, the algorithm is imperfect. It'll pick up things like that, but it won't pick up ads that have nudity. So Facebook really does need to work better to catch up with the way in which their users are uptaking the live streaming and other broadcasting tools.
Yeah, and in reading up, doing my research for this program, I learned that news anchor Christine Chubbuck killed herself on live TV in 1974 back in the United States. So yeah, as you say, you know, these are patterns of behavior that are not new to us. We just have new tools. It's been fascinating talking to you, Zuleika. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thanks so much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.